Thank you so much for being here. Let me get this going here. Now, thank you to the University of Minnesota. Thanks to you all for being here, especially when there's so much awesome stuff on television these days. I really appreciate you choosing to spend some time with me. Now, I'm especially excited to be here with you tonight because I get to talk to you about a few of my favorite topics of all time. I get to talk to you about comic books, about graphic novels, and about me. So I'm going to start with me. Here is normal me, and there is cartoon me. I actually have a hard time speaking without pictures. I think that's why I decided to do comics. So I apologize that I'm going to make you crane your necks a lot to look at my pictures. But I am an Asian American teacher and cartoonist. So I'm going to go through each of these pieces of my identity, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. I'll start with cartoonist. Being a cartoonist means that I draw comic books and graphic novels. I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and here are some of the comics and graphic novels that I've done during those 15 years. Before I move on, I want to clear up some confusion. A lot of the times people will come up and ask me, what's the difference between a comic book and a graphic novel? Really, graphic novel is kind of a marketing term. It's a way of separating the medium of comics from the genres that have dominated it for so long in this country. From, graphic novels meant to separate the comic book from superheroes and from funny animals. The way I like to think of it is a graphic novel is simply a comic book that is thick enough to deserve a square binding. Now, recently I became involved in these graphic novels here. Anyone seen this show called Avatar: The Last Airbender on Nickelodeon? Okay, those of you who don't have your hands up, you need to do yourselves a favor and go watch this show. This show is amazing. It is, to my mind, the best American-produced animated series ever. When the show aired from 2005 to 2008, I was a huge fan. And then just a few years ago, Dark Horse Comics acquired the license from Nickelodeon to continue the show as a series of graphic novels. One of the editors at Dark Horse was familiar with my work, so she asked me if I would be willing to write this for them, and I jumped at the chance, simply because I was such a huge admirer of that original show. I've been working on these for 3 years now. I've gotten to work very closely with the creators of the original show, and I feel like I've learned so much about storytelling and pacing and characterization. It's been an absolute joy. These 6 books, 5 of them are available now. The very last one in the corner will be released in about a week and a half, and it will finally reveal what happened to Zuko's mom. If you're a fan of the original show, you'll know what I'm talking about. These Avatar books are not my only books to be released. As Merrick mentioned, Boxers and Saints were put out by First Second Books a few weeks ago. And it's really funny that Mark brought up the scholarship that came out of the Boxer indemnities that the United States put out. Last year, I got the opportunity to go to Taiwan. It was this crazy trip where I ended up in front of the Taiwanese president. And I told him that I was doing this book about the Boxer Rebellion. And that scholarship is what he talked about. He talked about how the Boxer Rebellion was incredibly tragic. And it was. This is by far the most sad books that I've ever done. But he also talked about how the silver lining of that sad, sad cloud was the fact that these young Chinese men were able to go to the States and get a Western education. He believes that Taiwan, as it exists today, would not be had it not been for the scholarships that the United States put out. So that's a little overview of my work. What I'm going to do now is I'd like to talk about comics and graphic novels, but I'm going to do it from the perspective of those other 2 pieces of my identity. I want to first talk about comics as an Asian American, and then talk about comics as a teacher. Those of you who are fans of comics nowadays, who go to comic book stores and buy monthly comics, probably have noticed that we are going through something of an Asian invasion in the American comic book industry. Now, I don't have hard numbers to back this up, but from what I can see, it seems like Asian Americans are better represented in the American comic book industry than they are in any other American entertainment industry. I mean, there's Linda Berry and Greg Pak and Jay Lee, Jason Shiga, Martin Sandretta. There's just a lot of us. A lot. A lot. Now, that last guy that popped up on the screen, that's Jim Lee. In the 1990s, he became this fan favorite artist for doing a series of X-Men comics. Then he went on to found his own comic book company. He sold the comic book company he founded to DC Comics, to the publishers of Superman and Batman. And nowadays, he's one of the higher-ups at DC Comics. You could argue that Jim Lee is actually the most powerful man in American comics. So the most powerful man in American comics is an Asian American. That is causing the parents of Asian Americans all over to ask, how could this happen? You know, because obviously making comics is not one of the approved professions when it comes to Asian Americans. It is not doctor, lawyer, or engineer. And if you look at the history of American comics, of the way Asians and Asian Americans have been portrayed in American comics, this becomes even more perplexing. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. In the late 1800s, there's a huge influx of Chinese immigrant workers into America. And many Americans became really worried about it. They were worried about how all these immigrants were going to affect American culture. So pressure began to build on the United States Congress to do something about it. And newspapers all over the country started publishing cartoons like this that featured really stereotypical images of Chinese and of other Asians. They usually featured very exaggerated facial expressions and a very simplified version of traditional Chinese dress. Eventually, the folks behind images like this won, and in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which effectively ended all legal immigration from China into the United States. Now, this sort of imagery wasn't just limited to early American political cartoons. It was also found in early American comics. You've all heard of Batman. Did you know that Batman had his debut in this series called Detective Comics? If you go to your grandparents' basement and you dig around and you find this issue somewhere, you will be able to buy a house and a car and probably a small island. This book is worth a ton of money right now. Now, most comic book nerds know that Batman debuted in Detective Comics. What most people don't know is that Detective Comics did not debut with Batman. Batman didn't show up until issue number 27, which is why this issue is worth the most. For issue number 1, the publishers decided to use a character that they felt like was much more marketable and much more appealing than any of the heroic characters that they had in their stable. This is what the cover of Detective Comics number 1 looks like. The main character's name is Ching Lung, and he's what we refer to today as a yellow peril villain, as a villain that's designed to play on the fears that the Americans had of the Chinese. Ching Lung is this Chinese super genius who's bent on taking over the West. DC Comics, you know, the publishers of this comic and the publishers of Batman and Superman, they are the oldest surviving American comic book company. So they actually have a lot of these really strange Asian and Asian American heroes in their stable. I'll show you a few of them here. Not just heroes, heroes and villains. So during World War II, DC Comics had this team of superhero pilots called the Blackhawks, and they fought for the Allies. So there was one Blackhawk member from each of the Allied nations. The American, of course, was the leader. They all had these awesome, snazzy blue uniforms, right? Except for the Black Hawk from China. The Black Hawk from China looked like this. His name was General Chop Chop. He spoke with this crazy accent. He even had a catchphrase. Whenever he got mad, he would say, "Chop Chop been double clossed." Clossed with an L. DC during the 60s had this supervillain who was a yellow peril villain like Ching Lung. He was an arch enemy of Wonder Woman, and his name was Egg Fu. He was literally a man-sized yellow egg. And his superpower was he had this Fu Manchu mustache that he would be able to wrap his enemies around. Now, Egg Fu is actually still around in the DC universe today, but he did get a makeover, so this is what he looks like nowadays. These examples are all from DC. Marvel Comics, the other giant American comic book publisher, certainly was not free of these sorts of characters. One of Iron Man's arch nemeses is this guy named the Mandarin, who is, again, a classic yellow peril villain. He was a Chinese super genius who was bent on taking over the West. Now, I haven't seen Iron Man 3 yet. I have 4 kids, so we don't get out much. But from what I hear, the Mandarin does show up in the latest Iron Man movie, albeit in a modified form. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. I just haven't had the chance. Not all Chinese and Asian American comic book characters played into stereotypes. One of my favorite from the early days of American comics was this guy right here. His name is the Green Turtle. He appeared in Blazing Comics, and he appeared during the golden age of American comics, during the 1940s, when comics were actually selling in the millions every month. During this time, a whole bunch of different publishers were getting rich. So a bunch of businessmen started establishing these tiny little publishers and throwing characters out at the public. Everybody wanted to find the next Batman or the next Superman. So at this time, there was a Chinese-American artist named Chu Hing. He was one of the first Asian Americans working in the American comic book industry. His publisher asked him to create for them a superhero. So he does. He creates the Green Turtle. And here's the rumor about the Green Turtle. The rumor is that Chu Hing wanted him to be a Chinese-American superhero. And his publishers just didn't think that that would fly. So Chu Hing did something really passive-aggressive. If you read those early issues of Blazing Comics, Green Turtle almost always has his back to the reader. All you ever see is his cape. And when he does have his face turned around to you, something is blocking his face. It's either a piece of furniture, or it's another character's head, or in this case right here, it's his arm. So the rumor is that Chu Hing did this so that he could imagine his character as he intended, as a Chinese American. Now, instead of his face, periodically, we get this crazy shadow that the Green Turtle casts with this crazy turtle face. And it's never explained why this happened. But I personally think it's yet another expression of Chu Hing's passive aggression. Chu Hing didn't do his own coloring. The publisher did his own coloring. And for some reason, the publisher chose to give Chu Hing this really bright, weird pink for his skin. It was almost like the publishers were saying, you know what, this is a white guy. So on the page of these early Blazing Comics issues, you can almost see this fight between the artist and his publisher over the ethnicity of the Green Turtle. Now, unfortunately, Chu Hing did employ a lot of that stereotypical imagery that we saw used against Chinese immigrant workers during the late 1800s. He used that same imagery against the Japanese. So this was a World War II comic, and the villains were all Japanese. He employed the exaggerated facial features, including pointy ears. I have no idea how pointy ears became an Asian stereotype in the 1940s, but it keeps showing up. I've yet to meet a pointy-eared Asian guy. The Green Turtle was not very popular. His adventures only lasted about 5 issues before Blazing Comics was canceled. So we never find out the Green Turtle's secret origin or his secret identity. It's never confirmed whether he's a Chinese American or not. So this character intrigued me so much that this is actually my next project. In 2014, I worked with a Singaporean artist named Sunny Liu, and we're putting out a graphic novel called The Shadow Hero, where we are going to revive the Green Turtle and finally show his origin story. It was a lot of fun to work on. Sunny Liu is an amazing artist. I really encourage you to check it out. So, historically, American comics have not treated Asian Americans all that well. Things got a little bit better as time went on. In the 1970s, America went through this kung fu craze, largely because of Bruce Lee, and comics saw a whole bunch of Chinese American heroes pop up. They did play on a lot of stereotypes, but they weren't all necessarily incredibly negative, alien stereotypes. There was Shang-Chi, who was the master of Kung Fu. He's part of the Marvel Universe. He still shows up in the Marvel Universe from time to time. And then there was my favorite, Yang of the House of Yang from Charlatan Comics. In the 80s, the G.I. Joe franchise actually had a number of Asian and Asian American heroes. And these were actually, like the G.I. Joe Asian Americans, often were pretty complex characters. On Cobra, on the bad guys team, there was this guy named Storm Shadow, who was a Japanese ninja. And he was probably the most complex out of all the villains in G.I. Joe. He had very nuanced reasons for becoming a villain. And then on the Joe side, there was a G.I. Joe member named Quick Kick, who was a Japanese American and a ladies' man. When I was a kid and I found this out, it blew my mind. Here was this sexualized Asian American male. The reason why there were so many of these strong Asian and Asian American characters in the G.I. Joe franchise was because many of these early G.I. Joe stories were written by a Japanese American by the name of Larry Hama. Larry Hama is considered something of a legend in geek circles. I actually got the chance to hang out with him in New York a few years ago, and I discovered that Larry was actually the reason why Marvel Comics stopped coloring their Asian and Asian American characters in this bright yellow. He told me that when he was working in the Marvel bullpen in the 80s, he went down to visit the coloring department, and he asked them point blank, why do you color your Asian and Asian American characters this yellow? No human being has this as a skin color. And they said, you know, we've always done it that way. So Larry says, maybe you should stop. And they did. In the 90s, comics gradually got more and more diverse. The X-Men especially featured a lot of Asian and Asian American characters. There was Sunfire, who was a Japanese national who could shoot fire from his hands. There was Jubilee, who was a quintessentially Asian American character. She was a Chinese American girl who grew up in La Jolla, California. And then there was also Psylocke. Now, Psylocke started off as a Brit, but she was kidnapped by ninjas and given this hot Asian body, so I'm claiming her. So things have gotten better in comics throughout the decade, but that still doesn't explain our central question. Why? Why are there so many Asians and Asian Americans working in American comics today? This is a question that I like to discuss with my friends, usually during a Comic-Con after party, usually over a couple of beers. So what I'm going to share with you now are some of our drunken theories about why this might be. I'm going to share with you 3 of them. The first theory is from the structure of the comics medium. Now, comics are a combination of words and pictures. They're an interplay between words and pictures. If you look at European art and literature, usually in European high art and European high literature, comics pictures and words are seen as 2 separate disciplines. They're kept apart, especially when things get, you know, literary and serious. Whenever words and pictures do come together, the results are considered either vulgar or childish or immature, right? Words and pictures have to be separate for high art. If you look at Asian art and Asian literature traditions, it's the exact opposite. From the very beginning, words and pictures existed together. In fact, if you look at traditional Chinese brush painting or traditional Japanese printmaking, words and pictures have to be together. A work is not considered masterful unless both the image and the words are masterful. So maybe the reason why there's so many Asian Americans in the American comic scene is because our cultural heritage predisposes us to this combination of words and pictures. The second theory I'm going to give you is from the origin of the modern comic book. There's a lot of argument about this, but a lot of pop culture scholars will say that the comic book was actually an American invention, that the first comic book was Famous Funnies, which was published in 1933, and within a decade, comics had become this mass medium. If you look at the early practitioners of comics, most of the greats were Jewish Americans, and they were these Jewish American boys that grew up mostly in the poor neighborhoods in New York, right? There was Jack Kirby, who was born Jacob Kurtzberg. He's the co-creator of the Avengers and of Captain America and of Fantastic Four. There was Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, who were the creators of Superman. There was Stan Lee, who was born Stanley Lieber. He was the co-creator of Spider-Man, the co-creator of Avengers and of Fantastic Four. Joe Simon was the co-creator of Captain America. Will Eisner is this incredibly influential cartoonist. He did a strip called The Spirit in the 1940s. And in fact, the highest award in American comics, the Eisner Award, is named after him. Bob Kane, who was born Robert Kahn, is a co-creator of Batman. And Harvey Kurtzman was one of the founders of Mad Magazine. So all these young men, they were Jewish and they were mostly poor from working class backgrounds. In fact, the Jewish roots of American comics is very apparent in early comic stories. Take Superman, for example. Superman is, as a baby, he was launched by his parents in this metal basket out into space to save him from doom. And then he grows up to be the savior of this people. This is very much like Moses. Moses is a baby, was launched into the river in this basket of reeds, and he grows up to be a savior of people. Superman has a critical weakness that saps him of all of his strength. In his case, it's kryptonite. And this is very much like Samson, the Hebrew hero, who has a critical weakness that saps him of all of his strength. In his case, it's haircuts. So from the very beginning, American comics has been this haven for outsiders. It's been an outsider's medium. There aren't those traditional gatekeepers that there are in other forms of literature. So maybe Asian Americans are attracted to comics because of this outsiderliness. And in fact, I think a lot of Asian Americans find reflections of ourselves in these comic book stories, in these popular American comic book stories. Take Superman, for example. He has dark hair. He wears glasses. He's mild-mannered. He has two different names. He has an American name, Clark Kent, and he has this foreign name, Kal-El, that has a hyphen in it. He wears funny clothes sometimes, and then he wears American clothes at other times. His parents are these foreign scientists that speak a funny language and speak and wear the clothes of another culture. So maybe so many of us are in comics because we see these reflections of ourselves in this outsider's medium. The last theory that I'm going to present to you is one taken from American cultural trends. If you've gone to your local bookstore anytime recently, you'll know that we are seeing this huge influx of Japanese stories onto our shelves, right? In fact, at almost every bookstore, you'll find these guys right here. These are the manga aisle hobos. I've already said that comics are largely considered an American invention. The modern comic book is largely considered an American invention. Now, pretty soon after 1933, this idea got sent all over the world, and it took particular hold in a few places. One of those places was France, and another of those places was Japan. So after that, after the 1930s, Japan and America had these two developing parallel comics cultures that developed their own ways of doing things. They developed their own ways of telling stories. And each of them developed their own conventions. Often, the readers of within one culture had a hard time understanding the comics of the other culture. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a panel from a Japanese comic. Those of you who read manga, do you know what that little plus sign on her forehead means? You know what that means? That means that the character is angry. That's actually a vein that's popping out of the character's head, right? She's so angry a vein comes out. So this is something that up until very recently, you would not see in American comics. In Japan, this vein has become so common that it's taken on symbolic value. So you will actually see it used like this, or it's pure symbol. It's no longer even representing something that's physical. So maybe, so nowadays, these Japanese comics are becoming more and more popular in America. And these two different ways of telling stories are starting to merge together. So maybe Asian Americans are finding so much success in American comics because many of us grew up reading comics from both traditions. And many of us actually have started combining, we started combining these two different ways of telling stories long before it became popular. One of these examples is this guy right here. This is Derek Kirk Kim. He's a very prominent Korean-American cartoonist, and he, in fact, does use the angry vein. So unfortunately for the parents of Asian Americans everywhere, I think this trend is going to continue. And we are not going to see med school stealing away any Asian American cartoonists. So that's me talking about comics as an Asian American. I'd also like to talk about comics as a teacher. For years and years and years, for about 14 years, I taught computer science, math, and art at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California. Anyone heard of Bishop O'Dowd? We're kind of famous. mostly for our sports teams. We have amazing football, basketball, and volleyball teams. Because I taught computer science there, I generally had nothing to do with the football, basketball, and volleyball teams. More recently, I started teaching, as Merrick said, at Hamline University. I'm part of their MFA program in creative writing for children and young adults. So from time to time, people would find out that I was involved in comics and that I was also a teacher, and people would ask me, why should teachers care about comic books? Why should we care about comic books in education? I'm going to answer this from the perspective of a computer science teacher. So I'm going to give you a really techie, geeky answer. Okay? Computer people like to think of world history divided into two halves. There's the pre-computer half, the old world, and the post-computer half, the new world. So let's look at this old world. In the old world, text was the preferred medium of communication among academics. And there were really good reasons for this. First, text is incredibly portable. It's much easier to carry a book in your pocket than it is to carry like an oil painting or a symphony. Second, text is easy to create. Almost anybody can be taught how to read and write. That is not true for some of the instruments out there. And finally, text is incredibly easy to copy. You could take a paragraph of text written by somebody else, and you could copy it in your own handwriting. And even if your handwriting is drastically different, you're not going to fundamentally change the meaning of that text. That is not true for a drawing. If your drawing style is fundamentally different from the drawing style of the original art, you're going to change the meaning of that art. So text had all these advantages. It was portable, easy to create, easy to copy, but unfortunately, not all information is best conveyed through text. If I wanted to tell you what my 3-year-old sounded like when she wanted another cookie, it may be more effective for me to play you a videotape of her whining than it is to describe it to you in text. So let's take a look at the new world. Post-computers, we now live in a multimedia world where many of those traditional advantages that text had over other media are gone. So text used to be the most portable. Nowadays, it is just as easy to email a sound clip or a picture file as it is to email text. Text used to be the easiest to create. Now, if you want to create music, you don't even have to play an instrument. You could use something like GarageBand. And text was easy to copy. Nowadays, it is just as easy to copy, cut and paste a piece of a picture as it is to cut and paste a piece of text. So we live in this multimedia world where we are always interacting with multimedia documents, with documents where different kinds of media sit together in one unified experience for us. So that means that in this new century, in the post-computer world, the information that you're trying to communicate is going to determine the medium. Right? You don't just default to text. You think about what you're trying to say, and then you figure out what medium would be best to say it. This means that as educators, when we teach our students communication skills, we have to be a little bit deeper. We have to teach them the strengths and weaknesses of each of these different media. So what does this have to do with comics? Well, comics are by their nature multimedia. It's a multimedia medium. Comics is one single unified medium that is made up of two distinct media, made up of text and of still pictures. So in my mind, it's the perfect training ground for these 21st century communication skills. When you teach your kids to read comics, and especially when you teach your kids to make comics, you're teaching them to think deeply about media. For each piece of information that they want to communicate through their comic, they have to make a decision. Would this information be more effective as a piece of text in the caption or as a picture in the panel? Now, I have had 2 different experiences using comics in the classroom. I'm going to give you a really brief explanation of each. The first one was in a computer art class. So several years ago, my administrator approached me and one of the art teachers at our school, and they asked us to develop this brand new art class that would incorporate computer technology. So we did, and we set as our course objectives, first, we wanted to teach kids how to integrate traditional art media and computer technology. Second, we wanted to teach them those 21st century communication skills. We wanted to teach them to think about media in a deep way. And finally, at the time, our school was pushing this writing across the curriculum idea, which I think think is a great idea. There was this feeling that our students were not doing enough writing, and they wanted us to assign writing in all of the different subjects. So what we did was we came up with this class that was made up of 4 major units. The first unit was on still pictures, the second was on comics, the third was on animation, and the last one was on film. Here's what the comics unit looks like. First, we made our students do scripts. Now, for comics, there's not one standard script format. It's not like screenplays, where there's this very rigid format that you have to follow. Basically, we had our students describe in writing each of the panels that they were going to draw, and then the dialogue and the thought balloons and the sound effects that belonged in that panel. This was our way of getting kids to write in our class. Once they had their script done, they did character designs. Then from the character designs, they would do thumbnails, which are these tiny little sketches of each of the panels that they were going to eventually draw. And then they did their fine art. The way they produced their fine art was by drawing in pen and ink on paper first, scanning it in, cleaning it up on the computer, and then also lettering it on the computer. We also had them colored on the computer using Photoshop. And by the end, they knew how to integrate computer technology with traditional media. They knew how to think deeply about media, about 21st century communication. The second experience I had of teaching with comics was in an Algebra 2 class, of all places. Now, a few years after I started teaching that computer art class, my administration approached me and asked me to take over this Algebra 2 class. One of our math department members had to go on long-term leave, so they asked me to just be the long-term sub for that class. Now, unfortunately, during this time, I was also working as the school's educational technologist, which is just a fancy way of saying that I would help other teachers integrate computer technology into what they were doing in their classrooms. But what this meant for this Algebra 2 class that I was subbing is that every 2 or 3 weeks, I would have to be away from them for 2 or 3 days, because I'd be in some other teacher's class helping them out. And this is terrible, right? A sub for a sub is like the worst educational experience that you can have. So as a way of making up for my absence, I started videotaping my lectures. I would make sure to keep the lectures around 20 to 30 minutes long, not too long. I even tried to incorporate special effects. So I had these things where I would clap and then the board would magically erase. Then I would give these videotapes to my sub and ask them to play it for my students. And this was horrible. This ended up being terrible. My students would come up to me and go, "Mr. Yang, we thought you were boring in person, but on video you're unbearable," right? It ended up being terrible. So as a desperate second try, I started illustrating my lectures as comics. And I did this very quickly. I would just take a Sharpie, no pencils. I'd go straight in. I'd do 6 panels a page. Each lecture would end up anywhere between 4 and 6 pages long. And then I would take these really roughly drawn comics, I'd give them to my sub would Xerox them and pass them out to my students. Much to my surprise, this was actually incredibly successful. In fact, a lot of my students would come up to me after and tell me that they preferred me in cartoon form to in real life. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. But this experience intrigued me so much that, during this time, I was actually getting my master's degree in education from Cal State Hayward. And I was originally planning on doing my final project on computers in education. But this experience with this Algebra 2 class intrigued me so much that I decided to switch it around. And I ended up doing my final project on comics in education. First, I did an online webcomics version of those math lessons that I drew for my students. It's called Factoring with Mr. Yang and Mosley the Alien. And second is I did some research. I did some research about how comics have been used in the past. And what I found was when comics were in their heyday in the 1940s, there was actually a lot of research that was done on using comics in the classroom. But then the 50s rolled around, and during the 50s, comics ended up getting blamed for juvenile delinquency. In fact, comic book publishers were brought in front of the Senate to testify on how they were corrupting the youth. And after that, comics became this educational hot potato. Everybody just abandoned this idea of using comics in the classroom. And it wasn't until the 80s and 90s that people started coming back, that researchers started coming back and looking at how can we use this medium. What I found was that comics have very unique educational strengths. First, comics are visual. They're a visual storytelling medium, and our students are surrounded by visual media. But unlike visual media like animation and movies, comics are not a visual medium that you watch. They're a visual medium that you read. So comics are an effective bridge between media that our students watch and media that our students read. Second, comics are what I would call permanent. So if you look at a page of comics, past, present, and future all sit side by side, all on that one page. And what that means is that the rate of information transfer is actually firmly in the control of the reader. The reader determines how fast or how slow that information is conveyed. That is not true of the other visual storytelling media. That is not true of movies, that is not true of animation, and that is definitely not true of those video lectures that I gave, right? No self-respecting teenager is gonna ask the sub to rewind a piece of a lecture. So by doing my lectures in comics, I was effectively giving my students a remote control for the rate of information transfer. They could read it as quickly or as slowly as they wanted to. They could reread pieces of it if they wanted to. It was both visual and also permanent. I am definitely not the only educator who has discovered the educational power of comics. On the campus where I teach, my fellow teachers are now using both Mouse and Persepolis in classrooms. And these same books, Mouse and Persepolis, can be found in college campuses all around the nation. So really, I feel like we're in the middle of this renaissance in comics where many of the best comics that have ever been produced in America are being produced right now, and where educators and librarians and parents are starting to use comics in an educational way. They're starting to tap into that latent educational power. If you're interested in studying this further, I'm going to give you a few things to check out. First are these two books, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. If you're interested at all in comics, you have to read this book. Scott McCloud is the closest thing that we have to a professional comic book nerd. Understanding Comics is a comic book about how comic books work. Think about how nerdy you have to be to do a book like that. But it's amazing. I don't know if I would do I'd be doing comics right now if I hadn't read Understanding Comics in late high school. The other book is by Will Eisner, who I mentioned earlier. He's the creator of The Spirit. He also did a book about comics called Comics and Sequential Art, where he takes his decades and decades of experience as a communicator in comics and distills it into one textbook. My own publisher actually has two different books that I really love. I'd love them even if they weren't my publisher. The first one is by Jessica Abel and Matt Madden, both working cartoonists. They have a book called Drawing Words and Writing Pictures. This is a college textbook about how to make comics. It's broken up into 16 units. Jessica and Matt are both college professors. They've been teaching comics in a college environment for over a decade now. And they've taken all of their experience in the classroom and distilled it into this workbook. This actually, I mean, it's a full-on textbook. You read a chapter, and then there are exercises that you do. There's even extra credit that you can assign your students. It's amazing. The other one, Adventures in Cartooning, is targeted at a younger crowd. It is both a rollicking story about this knight chasing a dragon and a book about how the medium of comics works. It's done by a man named James Sturm, who teaches at the Center for Cartoon Studies. Like I said before, we are in the middle of this renaissance right now, or a comics renaissance that is producing new work and exciting ideas on all of these different fronts. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this scene, and I'm also incredibly honored to get the chance to share some of these ideas with you tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you.